We would all like to think that our projects always come out the way that we intend them, and if you just go by social media, you might get the idea that my projects and that other people who sews projects always come out right. But the truth is that they don't. Hello everybody, June here. Thank you for tuning in. Today I'm going to share with you something that I don't think I've ever shared before, but I think is important anyway. Regardless of how experienced a seamstress, dressmaker, sewer, whatever you want to call yourself you are, chances are that every now and then you're going to have a project that just does not work out. You muslin it, you make it, and then you realize that you kind of hate it and it just doesn't suit you, it doesn't look right on you, and then what do you do? I recently had an experience like this and it is not pleasant. So this whole thing started when I decided to make Simplicity 8833. And the picture on the pattern, it looks great. I had seen some pictures of it on social media and it looks great on people. So I thought, I'm going to give it a shot. I even muslined it. Granted, I muslined only the bodice just to make sure that it wasn't tight. And I decided that the muslin was fine and I cut into my fabric. Now my fabric is kind of precious and you can see some of it here, but the fabric is from Spain. It is non-replaceable, and even though it wasn't expensive, I really liked it. So I made the dress. I got to the point where all that it needed was to be hemmed and to have the elastic casing put in. And I decided to try it on because I was already having doubts just looking at it. I tried it on, and to sort of emulate the look of having the elastic in the waist without actually putting the elastic in the waist, I just belted it. And when I looked at myself in the mirror in that dress, I was horrified. I was heartbroken. It was huge. It was enormous, even though I sized down. We all know that the big four have a lot of ease, but this is kind of ridiculous. So it was huge, it was long, the sleeves just didn't really suit me, and I was never going to wear it. I slept on it, and the next day I was still hating it. And so I began to think about ways that I could save the fabric because I really liked it. And because the dress was so big, I knew that I would be able to get something out of it. And the one thing that came to mind was a pattern that I made last November. It is the October 02-215. So the second issue in the women's edition of October from 2015. It was style number 15 also. And I made it in the blue stretch brocade that I've talked about before. I will put a link here somewhere so that you can check it out. I knew that I could get the bodice out of this dress that was a failure, and it was probably the best idea that I've had in quite some time when it comes to sewing. And in this video I am going to show you how I transformed a dress from drab to fab. The first thing that I had to do was to essentially take the dress apart at the waist seam. I had already made the casing for the elastic, which means I had a stitch line that went roughly 5/8 of an inch up from the actual waistline to make the casing. But because I wanted to have as much of the bodice length as possible, I chose to pick out the casing seam so that I could then just have the seam allowance to deal with. And let me tell you that picking out that stitch line for the casing was a struggle because the fabric is seersucker and I could hardly see my stitches. So it took me a long time. Once the casing was out, I had to separate the bodice from the skirt. But because I had already serged the seams together, I just went ahead and I cut the seam allowance at the stitch line. This gave me enough length in the bodice to then work with, and also the skirt, which I used for the new dress as was long enough that I could just do away with the seam allowance without having to go through the trouble of picking out the serging, which if you have never done, it is not It is not as difficult as it might seem initially, but it is no picnic, and I just didn't want to have to go through the trouble of doing that and then picking out another seam. After this, the skirt was ready to be worked with, so I put that aside and I started working on the bodice, which still needed some more deconstructing. Here, I wasn't as concerned with saving fabric because it was very wide, so rather than spend the time picking the seams with a seam ripper, I just cut them off at the seam line for the fronts and the sides and the shoulders that you'll see in a moment, and I just went with it because it was much quicker. With the bodice fully deconstructed, the game of Tetris began, and I had to play around quite a bit with the pattern pieces to get them all to fit. I tried positioning the different pattern pieces on parts of the fabric to see what would work best, and in the end I was able to get all of the pattern pieces bar the center front from the bodice of the dress. And what is crazy is that actually the side front pieces, which are the biggest except for the center backs, I was able to get both of them from one single sleeve. That is how big the sleeves were. For the center front, I did have to cut into a small piece of fabric that I still had left, but I think given the size of the bodice and the size of the pattern pieces, I did pretty well with getting most of them from the fabric that the dress had used in the first place without having to go too much into the little fabric that I already had. But it was a real game of Tetris. After all the pattern pieces were cut out from the fashion fabric, the rest was just construction as I normally would. I thought that my Seersucker fabric was a little bit on the light side for a bodice that is this fitted, so I fully lined it with a cotton broadcloth that I had in my stash. Once I put the lining in, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about how I did that, I just went ahead and I took the skirt that I had taken off of the old dress, and I had to gather it a little bit to fit the waist of the new bodice, which is fine because I like gathered skirts. I attached the skirt to the bodice, and I had a dress that was only missing the zipper. And after all of that, I had to wait 3 days, not 6, 3 days, for a zipper to arrive because I didn't have any zippers that matched the color of the dress in a way that was pleasant, but that was also long enough for a dress. I'm quite short, so I thought that I could get away with the zipper length that I had, but I couldn't. I had to order zippers. And so I waited, and then I put in the zipper. I did a centered zipper. I debated whether I wanted to do invisible or centered, but I was worried that the bodice was going to be a little snug and that maybe having an invisible zipper would make it so that it stretched out or that you could actually see the zipper. So I made a center zipper, also known as a railroad zipper, and that turned out great. And after the zipper was in, I put on the whole dress, and I liked the length of the skirt, but because I liked the length of the skirt, it didn't leave me a whole lot of room for a hem. So in order to solve that problem, I used a hem tape. So the actual hem that I took off the dress is slight. It's between, I think it's about 1/4 of an inch or so. So it didn't change the length of the dress a whole lot, but it made for a good hem, and it looks pretty. And you may have caught a glimpse of it either in the pictures that I've shown you or on the video, but it is very pretty, and honestly, it's just, I love the hem. So after all of that, I was very, very happy with the results of the transformation of the dress. It is not something that I am in a rush to do again, but there are lessons to be learned from my experience. The lesson being that we all make mistakes, things just happen, and the only thing that you can do is just move on, learn the lesson, try to recover it. In the words of Tim Gunn, and by the way, I never actually have watched any of the Tim Gunn stuff, but you can't be in the sewing community and not have heard this. But anyhow, in the words of Tim Gunn, make it work. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time. Bye.